And thinking about, you know, how I want to go about presenting today on the Hungarian Revolution, essentially, I hope people are not disappointed, but I'm actually basically going to talk about Dunayevskaya and not at all about France or the Situationists. But everyone who wants to talk about those things should certainly feel free to do so. And there are plenty of people here who are quite knowledgeable about those things, about France in '68 and the Situationist group who can discuss it. But I was thinking that this series is on alternate attempts to create societies alternative to capitalism. Okay? And the Hungarian Revolution was, of course, one of those attempts, one of the most important, and in some ways, one could almost say the most important, because it was different from other such attempts and previous revolutions. And I will discuss why many people think that is so, the ways in which it is different, and why it is so very, very important. And of course, many approaches can be taken: historical, descriptive, theoretical, and so on and so forth. A lot of background is very relevant. You know, the history of Hungary itself, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, of the actual details of the satellite relationship between the Soviet Union and Hungary, and so on and so forth. There are many things that are highly relevant, and if someone were going to really become deeply knowledgeable and informed about the Hungarian Revolution, they would study all of those things. But I thought that, again, in the context of the notion of alternative societies that were attempted, that actually posed as alternatives to capitalism, that it might be a good idea, since Dunayevskaya talks at some length about the Hungarian Revolution, not only in the pages that were assigned to us for today, and I fault myself also for not having pointed out that there's another section in Marxism and Freedom where she talks about the Hungarian Revolution that is also, you know, has some pretty important things on pages 327 and 328. She also has some important comments on the Hungarian Revolution. So I thought, okay, talk about Raya, but wouldn't it be helpful to counterpose another sympathetic point of view on the Hungarian Revolution to Raya's point of view, just to bring things out, bring out the importance of Marxist humanism, you know, which is what our group stands for. And so instead of just talking about Raya, which is significant and important in itself, I would counterpose her to another thinker and writer on the Hungarian Revolution. And the person I selected was the well-known political philosopher Hannah Arendt. Probably everyone who's here has heard of her. I'm not sure how much people background have in Arendt. I don't have a very great background in her myself. But it turns out, in my research I discovered this, that in the second edition of her famous book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Arendt added a 40-page chapter on the Hungarian Revolution, which was omitted from all subsequent editions. It was not in the first edition. I might duplicate in my reading some of the things I said now here, but just to get things going. It appeared only in the second edition, and not in the first, and there have been several subsequent editions. But Arendt was, like Nissim-Sabat, a great enthusiast for the Hungarian Revolution, and for the same things that Ryan and James were enthusiastic about. Of course, the workers' councils. The workers' councils that were set up all over the country and that were the heart and soul of the revolution. Arendt loved them. Now, most people who write about Hannah Arendt say that she's uncategorizable, that's very hard to pin down exactly what her overall perspective is, and so on and so forth. That she certainly was not a Stalinist, that's for sure. She's not a Marxist either. She was critical of Marx, although if you read her on Marx, you can see that she was also not keen on capitalism either. Not keen on capitalism, nor was she a liberal. She really can't be classified as a liberal because, and this shows in her enthusiasm for the Hungarian Revolution, she rejected really representative government. Her model was the Greek police, and Aristotle's famous dictum that man is the political animal, zoon politikon. So she was not a liberal either. I mean, she died, I think, in the 80s, sometime in the 80s. I actually met her once because she taught at the University of Chicago, and I was living in Hyde Park, and I bumped into her in a coffee shop, and we chatted for a little while, and she paid for my lunch because she said students don't pay. That was at the old Green Door bookstore in Hyde Park. I found her pleasant, although I felt I was being looked at under a microscope, and I was, Peter, this is true, I never lie. Very shy in those days. Here we have someone who was profoundly affected by and moved by the Hungarian Revolution. The second edition of The Origins of Totalitarianism was published in 1968, 2 years after the revolution itself and 7 years after the first edition of The Origins of Totalitarianism. So, in this presentation, I'm going to kind of go back and forth between Arendt and Nissim-Sabat. And my aim, which is not entirely clear in my own mind, and it may not be clear to you, but maybe it will become clear during the course of the discussion, is to sort of generate insight. Now that's a tall order. That's what I've always hoped for as a professor of philosophy for 30 years and a psychotherapist for 20 years. I'm a really insight-oriented person. It's always the goal. So to somehow, in this back and forth, conjure up some sense, some image of what was truly great about the Hungarian Revolution in a more richer, perhaps, sense. Now, maybe you don't need that richer sense. You may have it already. But, I certainly need it, and so I'll begin. Again, I might repeat some of the things I just said, but then I will go on. Okay? The Hungarian Revolution exploded in October 1956 and lasted for 12 days before it was violently crushed by the second invasion of Russian tanks. They came and then they left, and then about a week later they came back and stayed. 2 years later, after 1956, in 1958, well, the revolution was on, I think, October 22nd, was it? 1956. 2 years later, in 1958, the second edition of Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, was published, 7 years after its first publication in 1951. This second edition contained a chapter which was obviously added on because it was the last chapter in the book of the second edition, chapter 14. And it's very hard to come by. I didn't get a chance, unfortunately, to go to the University of Chicago Library to see if they had it. They probably do. So I really didn't have access to the essay itself, but I did have access via the internet to various summaries, some quotations, so I do have some quotes from it to share with you today. But it's hard to find. Powell's bookstore did not have the second edition. So the second edition contained a chapter, the last one in the book, chapter 14, called Reflections on the Hungarian Revolution. It was, however, omitted from all subsequent editions of this now renowned work of political theory. In the same year, 1958, the first edition of Marxism and Freedom was published, in the very same year as the second edition of The Origins of Totalitarianism. So in the same year, 1958, the first edition of Maria Dunayevskaya's Marxism and Freedom was published. In the introduction to that first edition, Dunayevskaya wrote that, quote, "This book aims to reestablish Marxism in its original form, which Marx called, quote, a thoroughgoing naturalism or humanism," which is why we call ourselves Marxist Humanists. Only it's in some sense for us, we consider that redundant, because Marxism is humanism. But we call ourselves that to make clear to the world what our orientation is, because some have argued the opposite. This book, Ryan's saying, this book aims to reestablish Marxism in its original form, which Marx called a thoroughgoing naturalism or humanism. Marxism and Freedom, then, which contains several discussions of the Hungarian Revolution, was published in the same year as Arendt's 40-page essay on that revolution. Curious coincidence. Despite significant differences in their philosophical stances, which I will, of course, discuss, Arendt and Dunayevskaya shared great enthusiasm for the revolution. In particular, for the form of organization that established from its very inception, the workers' councils. Both Dunayevskaya and Arendt viewed the revolution as unique, as different in important ways from previous revolutions. For Dunayevskaya, the Hungarian Revolution was unique in its, quote, greater depth, the uncompromising stand, and the involvement of the whole population. And that is, of course, a very important point. That one of the things that made the Hungarian Revolution different from the Polish revolt that occurred a few weeks earlier and the East German revolt, which was when? 53. In Hungary, the entire population was involved in the revolution. Dunayevskaya also points out that, unlike East German and Polish revolts preceded, the Hungarian revolutionaries tore up their Communist Party membership cards. In other words, another really important aspect of the Hungarian Revolution, that it wasn't only the Soviet Russian overlords that they were rebelling against. It was their own indigenous, oppressive Stalinist regime of Hungarians that they wanted to get rid of. They tore up their Communist Party membership card, signaling that they saw as their oppressors not only the Russian overlords, but their own indigenous Hungarian oppressors. Quote, the Hungarian freedom fighters, Dunevskaya wrote, moved away from totalitarian state centralization to decentralized workers' councils, youth councils, councils of intellectuals, and so on and so forth. And, of course, they took over every major industry in Hungary. The mines, the railroads, everything. A parallel statement by Arendt summarizes the basic thrust of her writing on the revolution. Quote, the rise of the councils, not the restoration of parties, meaning political parties, was the clear sign of a true upsurge of democracy against dictatorship, of freedom against tyranny. Arendt also wrote that, quote, the Hungarian Revolution was perhaps the first historical example of Rosa Luxemburg's conception of spontaneous revolution. This sudden uprising of an oppressed people for the sake of freedom and hardly anything else, without the demoralizing chaos of military defeat preceding it, which was a feature, of course, of the Paris Commune. Without coup d'etat techniques, which could refer perhaps to the French Revolution, without a closely knit apparatus of organizers and conspirators, without the undermining propaganda of a revolutionary party. There was no revolutionary party in the Hungarian Revolution. There was just the people. So let me just read that again. Arendt wrote also that, quote, the Hungarian Revolution was perhaps the first historical example of Rosa Luxemburg's conception of spontaneous revolution, this sudden uprising of an oppressed people for the sake of freedom and hardly anything else, without the demoralizing chaos of military defeat preceding it, without coup d'etat techniques, without a closely knit apparatus of organizers and conspirators, without the undermining propaganda of the revolutionary party. And Arendt just loved that. All of that. However, a significant difference in their views can be seen in these remarks. Dunevskaya points out that what was, and by the way, it is characteristic of Arendt's thinking to be very negative about any and all political parties. She did not like political parties, because she believed, for one thing, that they were inevitably corrupt. And because she believed in what happened in the Hungarian Revolution, democracy from below. She was very much a from below thinker. However, a significant difference in the views can be seen in these remarks. Dunevskaya points out that what was rejected by the revolution was not political parties as such, and this is true, but the one-party system is what they hated, because that's all there was, one party. That's the one-party system that they hated. Dunevskaya writes that overnight, the one-party system disintegrated, and various political parties reappeared, along with small newspapers and radio stations. Hundreds of local and district organizations, from the Hungarian Revolutionary Youth Party to the old parties, including both smallholders, that's the name of one of the old parties, and social democrats appeared. So once the revolution was ongoing, multi-party panorama sprung up. And probably, you know, these parties went back to the pre-Soviet Stalinist era. Thus, Krunievskaya saw the restoration of a multi-party system as not necessarily antithetical to the formation of the Workers' Council. She didn't say that, so didn't see them as necessarily antithetical or something that would negatively affect the Workers' Councils. Why then did Arendt downplay the restoration of the multi-party mode of political function? Arendt's view on this can be understood in the light of her political theory, or rather, her theory of the political. This is what Arendt is noted for. By the way, I hope you will not think that in my discussion of Arendt, I am partial to her views. I'm not. I'm not partial to them. They're interesting and worth reading. She has been extremely influential in political theory. You know, extremely influential. And it's important for us to know something about her views because of that. But I'm not partial to her views. Arendt's view of this can be understood in the light of her political theory and theory of the political. This is what she's most noted here for. As you read something or what people are talking about is what we need is to restore the political. They're talking Arendt talk. Okay. For Arendt, the essence of democracy lay in the creation of institutions that would guarantee the continuous existence of public spaces. Spaces in which the political, understood by Arendt to mean free and open dialogue and debate, the domain of thinking and of the creation of the new, the domain of what she viewed as true freedom, domain of true freedom, could be enacted. For Arendt, the existence of such spaces required a sharp separation between the political and the private. What she called the private. There was the public, the political, the spaces for completely open and free dialogue and truth-telling. Okay? And the private. The sphere of the family and of private interest, including, for Arendt, economic interests, which she viewed as fundamentally private interests. She had a negative view of what she referred to as the social. According to Arendt, the social is a strange mixture of the private and the public, and its emergence led to capitalist commodity exchange economy, which she was not happy with, not for. She was not in favor of capitalist commodity exchange economy. And she saw this mixture of the private and the public, of the political domain and private interests. She called that, for some reason, it's her terminology, the social. Okay. And I think we can say that today in the United States, you know, the government is run on the basis of private interests. Totally. In other words, I think maybe Arendt, if she were alive today, would probably say that the political has been completely subsumed. That political space no longer exists in her sense of it. According to Arendt, yes, the social is a strange mixture of the private and public, and its emergence led to capitalist commodity exchange economy. and eventually to instrumental politics, which is characterized by professional parties, social welfare as a major political goal, and violence as legitimate political means. And part of her rather gross misunderstanding of Marx, Arendt thought that Marx believed that the revolution should end poverty. End poverty. That it was about ending poverty. And it wasn't. I mean, certainly Marx was in favor of ending poverty, and I assume that Arendt was too in favor of ending poverty. But what was much more important to her was freedom. Now, what Marx wanted to end was human alienation. That's what he wanted to end. The alienation brought about by labor, the conditions of labor in capitalism, by alienated labor. Okay. But Arendt somehow did not understand this about Marx. So let me just say that again. According to Arendt, the socialist estrangement of public and emergence led to capitalist commodity and exchange economy, and eventually to instrumental politics, which is characterized by professional parties, social welfare as a major political goal, and violence as legitimate political means. While in the ancient world the government maintained the public sphere, in the modern social world it primarily safeguards the interests of private owners. Thus, in the modern social political domain, liberty and property coincide, according to Arendt. But her solution, as it were, to that would be to totally separate out the political, the public, from private interests, including economic interests and so on and so forth. That was her solution. We can now see that what Arendt saw and admired greatly in the Hungarian Revolution was the formation of the workers' councils, which she saw as the opening up of free public space, separated from the technical aspects of administration and of economics, space in which free thinking could occur. Whereas both before and after the revolution, such spaces were utterly destroyed and non-existent. What remained was lies. In her essay on the Hungarian Revolution, Arendt wrote that, quote, the councils, as distinguished from the parties, have always emerged during the revolution itself, like the Russian Revolution, of course, where the Soviets emerged. They sprang from the people as spontaneous organs of action and of order. Nothing contradicts, this is still Arendt, nothing contradicts the old adage of the anarchistic and lawless natural inclinations of a people left without the constraint of its government more than the emergence of the councils that, especially during the Hungarian Revolution, were concerned with the reorganization of the political and economic life of the country and the establishment of a new order. So she's not against reorganization of economics as long as one kept it completely separate from the political domain. However, for Arendt, economics is, in fact, a matter of the private, not the public sphere. Arendt designated the private the sphere of necessity, the sphere of economics and production of needs and desires, in contradiction to the public, which is the sphere of freedom. Those terminologies should sound familiar since Marx spoke of the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom as well. But for Marx, we would enter the realm of freedom when the value form is abolished, but certainly not before that. Okay. But that's not in Arendt's perspective, because she thinks that if the political is separate from these other domains, then real freedom exists. And certainly, I could not see that at all. At all. Arendt designated the private, for Arendt, economics is a matter of the private, not the public sphere. Arendt designated the private, the sphere of necessity, the sphere of economics and production of needs and desires, in contradistinction to the public, which is a sphere of freedom. Arendt believed that one of Marx's mistakes, besides his use of dialectics, which Arendt conflated with determinism, she did not understand either Hegel or Marx and on the dialectic, which is anything but deterministic. This is a little bit of the Heideggerianism in her seeping through actually here, because it's all this train of thought that eventually led to postmodernism, you know, that logic is tyrannical. Ideas like that we have to get rid of all these so-called absolutes and so on and so forth. Arendt believed that one of Marx's mistakes, besides his use of dialectics, which Arendt conflated with determinism, was to have conflated freedom with ending poverty. For Arendt, ending poverty was not a political question. Not a political question. It's a question for some sort of technology of economics or something like that.
Sorry, Marilyn. She compared dialectics to what?
Sorry?
Determinism.
Determinism, yeah. In discussing the American Revolution, which she saw as superior to the French Revolution, as being more conducive to a Republican form of government, Arendt pointed out that it did not succeed. And this is interesting, that Jefferson understood this, and he tried to save the Republican mission of the American Revolution by advocating the establishment of wards or cantons, so that everyone would have a chance to enter the political domain. The citizens of such an elementary republic could be volunteer members who care for more than their private happiness and are concerned about the state of the world. So this coincides with what I mentioned before, that Arendt was really a bottom-up kind of person. She believed that people in general should and would voluntarily participate in the political process on even in the smallest political political spaces.
So it's the equivalent of like what the old style town hall meetings that, you know, they...
Yeah, like the old town hall meetings, stuff like that. And that what she thought was that, of course, there had to be other bodies sort of above the baseline political bodies, but that they would come about because the people in them would be chosen directly. That people would know who they were and say, oh, he or she, you know, would work well on this committee or whatever. That the bottoms-up aspect would not be violated in a system like that. where all other representatives, if there had to be some, would be chosen, would volunteer. But it wouldn't be, she thought, on the basis of anything but the people's sense that they were honorable, that they were truthful, and that would qualify them to serve. But she wrote a lot on the American Revolution, and I certainly trust her research on this, that apparently Jefferson was worried about this sort of thing.
Did she participate in the political process if she didn't?
Herself?
Yeah.
Yeah. Not that I know of, although, but she never became a full-time professor at a university. She never did. I'm sure such positions were offered her, but she refused them. She taught a couple of semesters here, a couple of semesters there, a couple of semesters there. Of course, she was active in Germany during the rise of Nazism, and was a freedom fighter of sorts during that phase. She didn't think that everyone had to participate in the political process. In fact, one of the things she said was that she believed was unknown in the ancient world, like in the paradigmatic Athenian democracy, was that people should have the right to refuse to participate. She was perfectly okay with that, not a problem, and that all those who participate would do so voluntarily. She didn't think everyone had to, but obviously she apparently thought that many would want to.
Did she say anything about whether if people didn't participate, how things would happen? You know what I mean? Like she did.
Yeah.
I understand what you're saying. Like she didn't think people had.
Well, she thought the world had happened already that way, you know. Of course, this goes to her theory of the origins of totalitarianism itself, which I don't feel fully equipped to talk about, but I have some more stuff on that later on. So, Aaron pointed out that she saw the American Revolution as superior to the French Revolution as being more conducive to a republican form of government. Aaron pointed out that it did not succeed the French Revolution, or the American Revolution too, and that Jefferson tried to save its mission by advocating the establishment of boards of cantons so that everyone would have a chance to enter the political domain, a chance. So you have to have very small political spaces to see to it that everyone has a chance. The citizens in such an elementary republic could be volunteer members who, Arendt said, care for more than their private happiness. See, this is what Arendt's notion of the private, a private happiness, a private happiness. She saw people in those terms, that in a certain sense, unless conditions opened up opportunities for other ways, that people would naturally seek their own private interests, so that the closing off of those spaces then converted us all into these kind of little monsters. What then is the difference in the views of Dunayevskaya and Arendt? The difference lies in the fact that Dunayevskaya involved in the project of recreating Marxism for our time. Her perspective is fundamentally Marxist. Dunayevskaya wrote that, quote, the attempts by the workers to seize the oil fields, rail centers, factories, and means of communication, and to run these by revolutionary committees, that is to say, workers' control of production, is the true sign of the attempts of the workers to effect total change. And that, of course, is very key for Nissim-Sabat's notion of revolution, to bring about total change, total transformation of society from the bottom up. Production remained the key, still quoting Nissim-Sabat, production remained the key, and the whole brunt of the struggle against Russian tyranny was borne by the workers. Now, someone I read that I came across said about Arendt that obviously she did not understand, she could have used, we should have locked her in a room and read to her Marxist economic and philosophical manuscripts to get through to her. Namely, she didn't quite get how alienated labor impacts on human beings. The destruction it wreaks in our sense of who and what we are as human beings. She didn't quite understand that. And that was pointed out. Some of you may know that Arendt published an article in Dissent, Dissent, kind of a leftish publication that has long been associated with the Democratic Socialists of America. I laughed because I lived amongst them for some years. Published in Dissent an article on Little Rock, Arkansas. At the time, I forget when it was in the 60s, Little Rock, or late 50s? Something like that. It was quite way back, the dawn of the Civil Rights Movement. It was after Brown v. Board of Education, right after Brown v. Board of Education, which was in 54. What happened was that, there was a move to integrate the Arkansas public schools. And, of course, the Arkansas racists were horrified by this, did everything they could to prevent it. And it boiled down to 9 students. I think they were about 9 or 10 years old, something like that, having to be escorted into a school. And it turned out that there was a series of plans were made how to get them into the school without violence. And the plans were changed. Originally, they were going to go into the schools themselves, and of course there was a wild mob outside the school. Then they changed the plan so that they would be escorted by some big men, whatever they were, into the schools. But the message about the change didn't get to one of the students, a little girl. And this little girl named Elizabeth tried to go into the school herself and was subjected to, horrible treatment, and left, and, was terribly, terribly traumatized by the whole event. And Arendt wrote a piece in Dissent in which she opposed, first of all, she objected to, she saw this as a mixing of the public and the private.
Oh, good Lord have mercy.
Now, let's be clear about this. Arendt was absolutely not a racist. She was a very, very ardent supporter of total civil rights for everyone. But her ideology, obviously here, got in her way. She felt that children, especially, should not be involved in this sort of process. It wasn't right to impose this on children. And the reason I brought this up is because, again, the criticism, actually, Ralph Ellison published a piece criticizing her piece. And what he said was that Arendt didn't seem to understand that every day of their lives, black people, including their children, were subjected to horrible treatment. That this was not new. So it's not a question of using children or not using children. Black parents had an overwhelming decision to make. The parents, especially of the 9 who were going to be the first ones to go into the school, had an incredibly difficult decision to make in allowing this. But of course, that was set in place, that the parents gave permission. Okay? But Arendt just didn't seem to understand, what it meant to be a black person, adult or child, in Little Rock, Arkansas, to begin with. So when she said, well, we shouldn't subject children to this, the fact is, Ellison said, they're already subjected to it every day of their lives. And she just didn't get it. So the same seems to be true about, she's a bit tone deaf for certain things, like what it means for a human being to be a slave to a machine, and what it does to their existence, their lives, their communities, this kind of exploitation on every level of one's being. It is as if Arendt thought that the complete separation of private interest from public discourse was the solution, for she thought that the strange mixture of public discourse and private interest was what led to capitalism, and that therefore the separation of public discourse and private interest would lead to an end to capitalism. And I suppose what she had in mind was something like in the domain of the political, of freedom, of free discourse and truth, etc., that decisions would be made that affect economics, but absent any private interest on the part of the political process and the people participating. It's as if that's what she thought. And that therefore the separation of public discourse and private interest would lead to an end to capitalism. They would sort of vote capitalism out of existence, kind of idea. Her notion reflects her interest in classical Greek democracy and Roman republicanism. I don't know whether Arendt wrote a word about Greek slavery, about slavery in the ancient world. I just don't know. But it's certainly something she should have thought about. Her notion reflects her interest in classical Greek democracy and Roman republicanism, wherein Arendt believed that private interest and public space was separated. Arendt's attitude towards the workers' councils seems to be that they were sort of ends in themselves, that in coming into existence as public spaces for free and open discussion, they have already brought about that which was lacking under various forms of oppression. That they could now exist as a search for the truth and the end of lying as a place for action to bring about the new. The new was something very big for Arendt. She had a concept that she called mentality. And as part of her theory of action, which was that freedom means the circumstances that allow one to act and to bring something of one's unique self thereby into existence as something radically new. But for Dunyanskaya, the Workers' Council's mission was to repudiate the Stalinist portrayal of the revolution in both Russia and Hungary, abolish private property, negate communism, and create a socialist society. Indeed, the president of the Borsod County Workers' Council said, this is an actual quote from, if anyone would like, I can write up a list of my sources and email it to you. I'd be glad to do that. I didn't bring any of that with me. But this is a quote from Borsod is a county in Hungary. Hungary is divided up into about 20 counties. So each one is pretty large. Okay? Quote from the president of the Borsod County Workers' Council. Quote, we will not return the land to great landowners, the factories to the capitalists, the mines to the barons, and the direction of our army to the enemies of the people. In another statement by the Miskolc Workers' Council, Miskolc is the capital, or was, of Borsod County. The Miskolc Workers' Council and Student Parliament of Borsod County said, we workers, students, and armed forces demand a new provisional government, truly democratic, sovereign, and independent, which will fight for a free and socialist country.